A widow stepped out into a wall of white and let the storm swallow her whole. Behind her, a fire, a locked door, 3 people she had every reason to leave out in the cold. Ahead of her, nothing. No path, no light, no way to tell the ground from the sky. Only a single orange rope paying out through her frozen hand, yard by yard, into the roaring dark. Somewhere out there, a man was dying. A man who had laughed at her, mocked her, tried to tear down the very thing that was about to save his life. The whole valley had called her crazy. They had printed it in the paper, dragged her into court. They had laughed. Right up until the night the mountain came for them all. And now, the only person who could save them was the woman they swore was out of her mind. The last nail went in on a gray afternoon, late in the cold season. The iron head struck true. The sound of it rolled down the slope and vanished into the pines below, the way a stone disappears into deep water. A woman stepped back from the timber frame. She pulled off one work glove, and she pressed her bare palm flat against the rough wood, still warm from the milling. It would not stay warm for long. Nothing on that mountain stayed warm for long. She was not a tall woman. She was not a young one. At 46, the dark of her hair had gone silver at the temples, and her hands carried the kind of calluses that only years of real work can leave behind. The lines around her eyes had been put there by weather and by grief, in something close to equal measure. She wore a man's canvas coat. It was too big in the shoulders. It hung past her hips, but it was the heaviest thing she owned, and on certain mornings, when the wind came down off the high ground and smelled of coming snow, that old coat felt like the closest thing to good sense she had left. She stood in the thin afternoon light and looked at what she had built, and she allowed herself exactly one honest moment to look at it before she pulled the glove back on. It was not pretty. Standing 3 feet outside the original log wall of her cabin was a second wall, rough, heavy, built from pine she had milled herself, board by board, over many long weeks. The gaps were packed with earth and stone. Every corner was braced with iron she had hauled up the mountain in a wagon, 2 trips at a time, because the road was too steep to risk more. The whole thing formed an unbroken shell around her home. From the road far below, from the eyes of anyone passing through the valley, it looked like a cabin that had been swallowed whole by some great wooden cage. She knew what they said about it. She had heard the words for months now, every time she came down into the little town for supplies. She picked up her hammer. She dropped it into the toolbox, and she went inside. The cabin was Elias's. He had built it with his own hands in the first year they came up to this high country, far from everything they had known. He had chosen the site himself, a south-facing ridge tucked in behind a natural shoulder of granite and old pine that broke the worst of the wind before it ever reached the door. He had a good eye for land, Elias did. He understood how the shape of the ground decides the shape of the weather, and how the weather, in the end, decides everything else. In all the years they lived on that ridge, the woman had taken his lessons so deep into herself that she sometimes heard his voice inside her own thinking, quiet, certain, the way a compass needle is certain. He had died in the dead heart of winter. He had gone out to check his trap lines, in a storm that was not supposed to amount to anything. 3 miles of familiar trail. a trail he had walked 200 times. But the storm changed its mind. It came down hard and fast and white, and it took the world away 1 foot at a time. He made it back to within a few hundred yards of his own front door before the cold took his legs out from under him. She found him the next morning, face down in the snow. His right hand was still closed around a length of trap wire, as though he had believed, right up to the last breath, that the wire would lead him home. It had not led him anywhere. She did not tell that story to people. There was no use in telling it. But 3 weeks after she buried the memory of that morning down inside herself, where it would not move, she went down to the hardware shelves in town and bought 400 yards of bright orange rope. She carried it back up the mountain, and she coiled it on a hook beside her front door, where it hung, year after year, waiting. The few people who came up to the cabin in those early years, back when people still came, sometimes asked about the rope. She told them it was for the horses. They believed her. People mostly believe the easy answer. Now the rope had a companion. On the outer wall of her new structure, beside the heavy storm door she had built and fitted with a steel locking bar, she had set a large iron ring. She bolted it clean through the timber frame, into stone she had poured, and set herself. And on the morning she drove the last nail, she hung the orange rope from that ring, 400 yards, long enough to reach the place where Elias had fallen, and still have rope to spare. The neighbors did not know any of this. They did not know about the husband, or the trap wire, or the long white morning that had taken everything. They did not know why the rope was orange, or why it was 400 yards, or why a widow had spent every spare hour of an entire season building a thing that made her home look like something between a fort and a great wooden trap. What they knew was simpler. She was strange. She was alone. And somewhere along the way, they had quietly decided those two facts were the same fact. The design itself was sound. It needed no faith to believe in. It only needed eyes. The 3-foot gap between the outer wall and the cabin was not empty space. It was a corridor of still, trapped air, packed with insulation and stacked cordwood that kept the killing cold outside from ever touching the living walls of her home. The outer wall broke the wind. The corridor swallowed the cold. And the inner cabin, wrapped and shielded on every side, would hold its heat on a fraction of the fuel her neighbors would burn fighting the weather head-on, instead of outwitting it. It was the same simple principle that keeps a covered cup of coffee warm long after an open one goes cold, only built at the scale of a house. But the people in the valley did not see a clever thing. They saw a strange woman building a cage around her own life. And there was one man in particular who gave them the words for it. Harlan Briggs ran the only general store in town. A low building on the main street that smelled of sawdust and dried beans, and the particular kind of authority that settles into a man who knows that everyone, sooner or later, has to come to him. He was 51, broad through the shoulders, a white beard he kept neat, and opinions he did not keep neat at all. He had a gift for the well-timed remark, delivered at exactly the right volume for the room to hear, and every time the widow came down for supplies, Harlan found his moment. The first time, she bought insulation and a box of iron brackets. He leaned on his counter, arms crossed, and said, loud enough for the men playing cards in the corner. "Building something up there, are we?" She told him she was keeping out the draft. He smiled the smile of a man who had already decided what her answer meant. The second time, she bought more brackets and stone and heavy wire. "Starting to look like a fort up there," he said to the room, "from what folks are telling me." She set her coins on the counter and said nothing. The card players laughed. The third time, the tone changed. The store was full that day. Harlan waited until every head had turned his way, and then he reached under the counter and brought out a folded newspaper. "Recognize anyone?" he said, laying it down between them. It was a paper from the city, the one that came up on the stage. And there, on an inside page, below an advertisement for some patent tonic, was a short paragraph under a small, cruel headline. A few mocking lines about a peculiar structure on the ridge, a widow's fortress that had the whole valley baffled. The source was unnamed. The tone was the tone people use when they have decided a thing is funny, without ever once trying to understand it. The woman looked at the paper, then she looked at Harlan Briggs. She counted out her coins, exact to the last one. "Thank you, Harlan," she said. And she picked up her goods and walked to the door. Behind her, she heard the low sound of a room laughing, the sound of people who have been given permission. She was almost to the door when she heard something else, a young voice, high, sudden, a girl on the edge of a laugh, and then, just as quickly, silenced, as though the owner of that voice had caught herself in the middle of it and stopped. The woman did not turn around, but she had spent 2 long years in another lifetime tending the wounded in a war whose name she did not say anymore. And she had learned in those years to read a sound the way a tracker reads the ground. That voice was young, 16 perhaps, and it had stopped too quickly to be cruelty. It was the sound of a girl who had begun to laugh with the room, and then, for a reason she could not yet name, had decided not to. The woman stepped out into the cold air, and she did not let herself think about it again. Not on the surface. But some things settle below the surface and wait. That evening, she sat by her fire with a cup of plain water and an old notebook. It had been Elias's first, a record of weather kept faithfully from the first year they arrived, right up until the year he died. After that, she had kept it herself, page after page, season after season, the careful continuation of a conversation with a man who was no longer there to read it. And it was this record, these patient columns of wind and frost and snow, that told her what she needed to know. The wind on the ridge had shifted. Twice in 3 years it had crept around, away from where it used to come from, turning slowly toward the colder quarter. The old pines on the high ground above her land had thickened their bark on the windward side, a thing that does not happen in a single hard season, a thing that takes years of steady cold to make. And the elk that wintered in the low country had come down this season wearing coats heavier than any she had set down in all her pages. She had stood close to one of the great bulls in the autumn light, close enough to run her hand through the fur. And what she felt under her palm was not the coat of an animal bracing for an ordinary winter. It was the coat of an animal preparing for something older, something harder, something it carried in its blood from a time before any of them. Taken one at a time, the signs were merely interesting. Taken together, they were not. She closed the notebook and set it back on the shelf beside Elias's old surveying glass. Then she went to bed, and she slept without trouble. She had taught herself, long ago in those war years she did not speak of, that sleep was a kind of currency, and that a person who could not spend it did not last. There was one other soul on that mountain who understood the weather the way she did, an old woman named Idella Rowan. She had lived higher up the ridge than anyone, longer than anyone could clearly remember, in a small place she had made for herself out of stone and patience. Idella came down the slope the way she always came, on foot, without warning, appearing out of the trees in the morning light with a worn blanket about her shoulders and an expression the widow had long since learned to read as approval. The old woman knew the high country the way the widow knew the workings of a wound, not from books, from the inside. In the years after Elias died, it was Idella who had taught her to read the bark of a pine for the moisture held inside it, to tell from the run of a creek in autumn what the snow would do in deep winter, and to hear the difference between the silence before an ordinary storm and the silence before something else. Idella stopped before the new outer wall. She stood a long moment, turning her eyes slowly along the whole length of it, corner to corner, checking it the way a carpenter checks a line. Then she nodded, once, and said nothing. "Come in," the widow said. "I'll put the kettle on." They sat at the table by the window, and they drank their tea, and the quiet between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that takes years to build and cannot be rushed. Idella looked around the inside of the cabin, at the cordwood stacked in the corner, at the new seals run tight along every window frame, at the iron ring and the orange rope, just visible through the inner door. "I have seen a winter like the one that is coming," the old woman said at last. "Once, when I was a girl." She held her cup in both hands. "The high villages lost people that year, more than they could bury before the thaw." "Did anyone warn them?" the widow asked. "One old man did," Idella said. "He read the signs for months. He told them what the animals were showing, what the wind was saying." She was quiet for a moment. "They called him confused, an old fool talking to the birds." She looked up over the rim of her cup. And then the deep cold came. The widow thought about the folded newspaper on Harlan Briggs's counter. She thought about the laughter and the permission in it. "People name the things they don't understand," she said. Idella made a sound that was almost a laugh. "They name them," she said, "and then they come and borrow the name back on the night they need it most." She set her cup down. "Your wall is good. The corridor will hold the cold out of the wood. You'll burn a third of what the others burn." "I know," the widow said. "The others won't have that." It was not a question. "No," the widow said. "They won't." Idella looked out the window, down the slope toward the south, toward a great lodge of dressed timber and wide glass windows that had gone up on the lower land over the season. A bright, proud thing. It caught the afternoon light and threw it back across the ridge like a signal. "The young man from the city," the old woman said. "He believes his fine stove will be enough." "He believes his money will be enough," the widow answered. The stove is only the thing he bought with it. They sat together until the light began to change. Then Adela gathered her blanket and stood. She was not tall, and the years had curved her a little forward. But she stood with the stillness of a person who has long since stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. "A man with a paper will come to your door," she said. "Before the snow." "Not yet," the widow said. "But he will." Idella nodded, as though this were already decided. "He is not a bad man," she said. "I know that. The bad ones are easier." And she left, moving back through the pines without a sound until the shadows took her, and the widow could no longer tell which dark shape was the old woman and which was only the trees. That night, the walls stood solid around the little cabin. The fire burned low and even, and the woman sat alone with the orange rope hanging on its ring, 400 yards of it, coiled and waiting in the dark. She had been so certain. Every single day for an entire season, she had moved through the work and the laughter and the small cruelties with the steadiness of a person who has decided and does not have to keep deciding. But there, in the late quiet, with the fire burning down to coals, and the wind beginning to find a new and unfamiliar voice out in the pines, a different kind of question rose up in her. One she had not let herself ask out loud. Was she still on this mountain because she had chosen it? Or because she had never once figured out how to be anywhere else? Because Elias was in that ground, down the slope, in the place she had finally been able to dig when the earth at last gave way to spring. Because to leave the mountain would be to leave the last place his hands had touched every single wall. She sat with the question a long time. She did not answer it. She got up. She pulled on her gloves, and she went out into the cold corridor between the two walls, in the dark. By the thin light from the inner window, she checked every seal one more time. She checked the hinges on the storm door. She checked the nails on the corner where the wind would hit hardest when it finally came. Then she went back inside. She hung her gloves by the door, and she went to bed. The question stayed where it was, but she had learned something in those years she did not speak of. She had learned that some questions are patient, that they do not need an answer the night they are asked, that they wait, and that their answers come in their own time, usually when a person is in the middle of something else entirely and has no time left to argue with them. The young man from the city arrived on the lower land in the warm season, and by the end of summer, he was impossible to ignore. His name was Preston Vance. He was 28 years old, and he carried the particular kind of confidence that belongs to young men who have succeeded early at things other people found difficult. His father had made a fortune in trade, far to the east, and had spent a good portion of it sending his son to the finest schools that money could open. Preston had taken what those schools gave him and turned it into ventures of his own. Land, speculation, quick profit in raw new country, and the results had exceeded even his own bold predictions. A thing he was not in the least modest about mentioning. He was not a stupid man. The widow understood that almost at once. The first time she saw him was on a bright afternoon, when he rode past her land on his way back from looking over his own building site. He stopped his horse at the low fence that marked the edge of her property. He looked at the outer wall she was raising, and he studied it. a full minute, without a word. Then he said, "What are you building?" "A wall," she said. "I can see that it's a wall." "What kind?" "The kind that keeps the cold out." He looked at it a moment longer. "You already have a cabin." "Yes, that wall is outside the cabin." 3 feet outside? She watched him turn it over. She could see a genuinely quick mind working at the puzzle, arriving at the right answer, and then setting that answer aside as too strange to be true. "That's an interesting design," he said at last. He said it in the tone of a man who means the exact opposite. "It works," she said, and she went back to her work. He watched her a few seconds more. Then he rode on. She did not see him again for 2 weeks. And when she did, it was in a very different setting. It was inside Harlan Briggs's store, where Preston Vance was holding court at the counter with the easy charm of a young man who has learned to perform his own cleverness for a crowd. He saw her come in. He let her get all the way to the counter, and then he turned to the men beside him and said, in a voice pitched for the whole room, "I asked our neighbor about her building project last week." He paused for effect. "She tells me it keeps the cold out. So she's built herself a wall, 3 feet outside her existing cabin, no roof over the gap. A wall against the cold." Harlan Briggs laughed first. He usually did. And the others followed, the way a room follows the man who owns it. "Maybe she's expecting a siege," one of them said. "From what?" another answered. And they all laughed again. The widow set her coins on the counter. Harlan was still smiling as he counted back her change. "Last of the insulation," she said. "I'm nearly finished." She was at the door when Preston called after her, still performing, still at exactly the right volume for the room. "Good luck with it," he said. "I'm sure it'll be very effective against whatever it is you're so afraid of." She stopped walking. She did not turn around. She stood there with her hand on the door frame, and she said, to the door in front of her, clear enough for every soul in that room to hear, "I am not afraid of anything, Mr. Vance. I am prepared for something. Those are not the same thing." And she went out into the street. She did not hear the room behind her, but she felt it. The way you feel the change in the air when a heavy door swings shut. Down on the ridge below her own land, there was a fine, large house, and it belonged to a man named Edmund Hale. He was 41, a lawyer by trade, from a great city far away. He had bought the high land as a place to escape to, and then built upon it a house so grand that the escape itself began to look like an excuse. 2 stories of dressed log, a wide front porch, and along the southern face, a long row of great glass windows that he had ordered, at considerable expense, brought up from far away over rough roads. Those windows were the first thing he mentioned to any visitor, and they were the very last thing the widow thought of whenever she looked across the ridge at his house. His wife was named Lavinia. She was 36, dark-haired, educated in the Eastern way, the kind that announces itself in small, precise gestures and the careful smoothing away of any local accent. She was not unkind. The widow had decided that early. She was simply a woman who had arranged her whole understanding of the world and found in that arrangement no shelf, no drawer, no place at all for a strange widow on a mountain, and she had not yet been given a reason to rearrange a single thing. The Hales held a great dinner late in the autumn, 10 days after the widow drove the last nail into her outer wall. She was invited. She declined. She sent a short, polite note down the mountain, saying only that she had work left to finish, which was true, and which was a far kinder explanation than the real one. She heard later what was said at that dinner. Edmund Hale had spent the weeks before it consulting old books of law and the clerks who knew them. He had found, buried in the language of property and boundary, a provision he believed he could use. And he had decided to use it. He told this to his guests the way a man tells a mildly amusing story, the kind that begins with an unreasonable neighbor and ends with the law providing a satisfying correction. The table laughed in all the right places, and Preston Vance, by every account, had been the loudest of all. He described the widow's strange wall in detail, adding flourishes he could not possibly have witnessed himself, and he finished with something about veterans of old wars, carrying ideas fixed too hard in their heads, ideas that did not travel well into peacetime. The table found that very funny indeed. But there was one person at that table who did not. Lavinia Hale laughed along with the rest. At first. But at some point in the evening, when the talk had moved on to other things, she looked out the great south window toward the dark ridge where the widow's land lay, and she said something, low, under her breath. The man who served the table did not catch the words. He noticed only that her face, in that moment, was not the face she had worn while laughing. He could not have said what the difference was, only that there was one. The widow received this account sitting at her own table, her hands flat on the wood, the way she sat when she needed to think without the interference of motion. She sat that way a long time after the telling was done. It doesn't matter, she said at last. I know, said Adela Rowan. I'm telling you anyway. Because you think I should know what's coming. The old woman looked at her across the table with those careful, patient eyes that had already seen one killing winter long ago and counted the graves it left behind. I am telling you, Idella said, so that when it comes, you will remember that you already knew, that it will not be a surprise, that you will be ready. The widow looked at her own hands on the table. I'm always ready. Not always, Idella said, quietly, and without any cruelty in it at all. Not for everything. She left before dark, and the widow sat alone in the cabin, with the fire going, and the wall solid around her, and the orange rope on its ring. She thought about what the old woman had said. She thought about Elias. She thought about the graves in that long ago winter, and the old man they had called a fool, right up until the cold proved him right. And she did not sleep well that night, which was unusual for her, unusual enough that she noted it in the margin of the weather journal as a thing worth remembering. Outside, the first true cold of the season came down off the high ground and wrapped the ridge in a deep and total silence. And somewhere in the old pines, above the property line, something moved through the upper branches without a sound, heading south, and not stopping. The man with the paper came on a quiet morning, just as Adela had said he would. His name was Wyatt Shaw. He was the deputy of the little town, and he had been for some years. 39 years old. Lean. With a permanent squint that came not from suspicion, but from too many seasons spent riding into a low sun. The widow had always seen him clearly for what he was, an honest man, doing his work inside a system that was not always honest, and trying, every day, to keep those two facts from colliding. He rode up the mountain road on a gray horse, his coat buttoned tight against the wind, a folded document in his left hand. He dismounted. He tied his horse to the fence post. And he walked to the outer door with the look of a man who has been handed an errand he never asked to carry. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Deputy Shaw." She stood in the gap between her two walls, where she had been checking the seal on the storm door hinges. The corridor was cold, but it was windless. "What can I do for you?" He held out the paper. She took it. She unfolded it. She read it. It was a formal notice, a complaint of a disputed boundary, and an unauthorized structure built upon the contested ground. It ordered all building to cease. The language was careful and legal and entirely clear. She folded it back up and held it out to him. He did not take it. "It's a legal notice, ma'am," he said. "It has to stand. I understand what it is. Mr. Hale has hired an attorney. There'll be a hearing, likely in the spring." "In the spring," she repeated, and she looked up, past the deputy, toward the northern sky, where the color of the high clouds was beginning to change in a way that had nothing to do with the hour of the day. "Deputy, I respect you. I want that to be clear before I say what I'm about to say. Go ahead. I will not stop building." Shaw was quiet a moment. His horse shifted on its tie. "That puts you in violation of a lawful order." "Yes, I'd be within my rights to make you stop." She looked at him, not with anger, not with the brittle defiance of someone spoiling for a fight. She looked at him the way she looked at every truth she had already settled in her own mind, with a kind of quiet certainty that he would tell people later he found just slightly unnerving. "You would be within your rights," she said. "You know where to find me." Wyatt Shaw stood there a long moment. He looked at the widow in her husband's coat, with her work gloves on, the iron ring behind her, and the orange rope coiled on its hook. And he made a decision that he would spend the whole long winter being unsure about. He set the document on the outer window ledge. He weighted it down with a stone so the wind would not carry it off. "I'll be back to check the road in a couple weeks," he said. "Good day." He mounted his horse, and he rode back down the mountain without once looking back. He had not enforced the order. He had not withdrawn it either, and they both understood exactly what that meant. But the law did not stay so quiet for long. 2 weeks later, Edmund Hale's attorney did something more. A second paper came up the mountain, and this one was sharper than the first. It did not merely ask her to stop, it set a date, a day fixed and final, by which the disputed structure was to be taken down, by her own hand, or by the hand of others sent to do it for her. The widow read that second notice standing in her corridor. She read it twice, and then she looked out, through the gap in her walls, at the northern sky. She folded the notice. She set it beside the first one, under the same stone, and she went back to her work. Because the wall was finished now, but a finished thing still has to be tended. And there was no power on that ridge, legal or otherwise, that was going to make her stop tending it. That night, she did her arithmetic again, by lamplight, the fixed date on the paper, the deep of the winter. She set them down side by side, in her mind, like two columns in the weather journal, and she saw for the first time that they fell on nearly the same stretch of days. Whoever climbed this mountain to tear her wall down would have to do it in the very teeth of whatever was coming off that northern sky. She almost smiled. They had set a deadline. In a warm office far away, off a calendar that knew nothing about this ridge, and the mountain had set one too. Only one of those deadlines was going to be kept, and it was not going to be theirs. Word of the second notice traveled down the mountain faster than she did. By the time she next came into town, the whole valley seemed to know that the widow on the ridge had been told, in plain legal language, to tear her strange wall down, and had simply refused. Harlan Briggs found this delicious. He told the story at his counter to anyone who would stand still for it. How the foolish widow had built her foolish wall, and now the law itself had told her to take it down, and still she would not see sense. Stubborn, he said, shaking his head, the word warm with satisfaction in his mouth. Just stubborn. But there was a cost to her stubbornness that Harlan did not see, or chose not to. She had spent nearly everything she had on that wall: the milled timber, the iron, the stone, the endless small supplies. The work had eaten through years of careful saving, the way a hard frost eats through a late garden. And now, with the cold season closing in and the law threatening her shelter, the money was nearly gone. She did the figures at her table one night, by lamplight. She counted what was left. She counted what the winter would demand. And the two numbers did not love each other. She would have enough, barely, if nothing went wrong, if no horse fell lame, if no tool broke that could not be mended, if she burned only the third of the fuel her wall would let her burn, and not a stick more. She put the coins back in their tin. She put the tin back on its shelf. And she understood, with a clarity that did not frighten her but did not comfort her either, that she had bet everything she had on being right, that if she was wrong about the winter, she had ruined herself for nothing, and that there was no longer any road back to the safe, ordinary version of her life, where she had simply kept her money and her peace and let the draft come in. She had burned that road behind her, board by board, with her own two hands. There was only forward now, only the wall and the rope and the sky. The girl came to her not long after that. Her name was Nessa Briggs. She was Harlan's daughter, 16 years old. She had her father's coloring and her dead mother's eyes. And she moved through the world with the quiet, efficient unhappiness of a young person who has not yet figured out how to want a different life than the one she's been handed. It was the girl, the widow, realized later, who had laughed in the store that day, and then stopped. The girl who had caught herself in the middle of the laughter for a reason she could not yet name. Nessa came up the mountain on a cold, clear afternoon, on foot, alone. She did not say much. She stood at the edge of the clearing for a while, looking at the wall, the way her father's customers looked at it, but without the sneer. Then she came closer. "My father doesn't know I'm here," she said. "I figured as much," said the widow. The girl looked at the structure a long moment. "Everyone says it's foolish." "I've heard." "But you're not foolish." The girl said it plainly, like a fact she had checked. "I've watched you in the store. You count your money exact. You never buy what you don't need. You don't talk just to fill the quiet. She looked up. Foolish people aren't like that. The widow looked at the girl for a long moment. There was something in that young, plain face that had not been there at the start of the season, something that had stopped laughing at the right time and had not started again. Why did you come up here, Nessa? The girl was quiet for a while. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower. Because I wanted to know if I was right, she said. About you. Before everyone else finds out the hard way that they were wrong. And the widow felt something move in her chest. A small, unexpected thing. The thing a person feels when she has been looking, without knowing it, for one single pair of honest eyes, and finds them, at last, in the most unlikely place of all. Come in, she said. I'll put the kettle on. They sat at the table by the window, and the widow did something she had not done with anyone but Adela in a very long time. She talked. She showed the girl the weather journal, the careful columns, the shift of the wind, page after page. She told her about the bark of the pines and what thick bark on the windward side really meant. She told her about the heavy coats of the elk and how an animal knows a thing in its blood long before any person can prove it with numbers. The girl listened the way the young listen when something has finally caught them, completely, without performing. And when the light began to change, and Nessa stood to go, she stopped at the door. My mother used to read things like that, the girl said. The weather, the animals. She said her own grandmother taught her. She looked down. Nobody ever taught me. She died before she could. The widow looked at the girl in the doorway, and for just a moment, she saw something she had not let herself think about in years. Not a daughter. She would not let herself think that word, but the shape of a thing that might have been in some other life, on some other mountain, where the storms had been kinder. Come back in the spring, she said. When the snow is off the upper trail, we'll start with the bark. The girl's face changed. It was a small change. The young learn early to guard their hopes. But it was there. You mean it? She said. I don't say things I don't mean, said the widow. You said so yourself. Nessa Briggs went back down the mountain in the failing light. And the widow stood in her doorway and watched her go, until the girl was only a small dark shape on the white road. And then not even that. Then she turned and went back inside to her fire and her wall and her waiting rope. There was one more visitor that season, and of all of them, she was the most unexpected. Lavinia Hale came up the mountain on a cold afternoon, deep in the season, when her husband was away, alone, on foot. She carried a cloth-wrapped parcel that turned out to hold a fine tin of tea and a small cake. She knocked on the outer storm door, 3 brisk knocks, and she stood back and waited. The widow opened the inner door and looked through the corridor at the figure on the far side of her wall, the woman whose husband had sent papers up this mountain. Twice. She looked at her a long moment. Then she unlatched the storm door and opened it. Lavinia Hale stood in the thin winter light, her expensive coat buttoned to the throat, her face working very hard to seem casual. I thought I would call, she said. I hope it isn't an imposition. The widow looked at her. Come in. They sat at the table, and they drank their tea, and the conversation was careful. The way conversation is careful between two women who have said things about each other in company and now find themselves face to face with no company at all to hide behind. Lavinia admired the cabin. The widow thanked her. Lavinia asked with real curiosity about the corridor and how it worked. And the widow explained it, plainly, without the tone of a person who needs to be proven right. Lavinia listened. She was quiet a moment after. Then she said, "I told my husband, after the dinner, that I thought you seemed like someone who knew exactly what she was doing. And what did he say? He said I was being sentimental." She looked down into her cup. "He says that to me," she went on slowly, "when what he means is that I'm seeing something he would rather not see." The widow said nothing. She refilled the tea. "The windows," Lavinia said suddenly. "He had them brought up from so far away. He was so proud of them. They cost a great deal." She stopped. "How strong does glass need to be," she said, "to stand against a wind like the one that comes off these mountains?" The question sat between them, like a stone dropped into still water. "Stronger than what you have," the widow said. Lavinia nodded, slowly, as though this had only confirmed something she had been carrying alone for a while now, and was very tired of carrying. "I see," she said. She stayed another hour, and before she left, she stood in the cold corridor between the two walls, and she put her bare hand flat against the inner wall of the widow's cabin. The wall was warm, thick old log, dry for years, with the outer structure breaking the wind 3 feet away. It held its heat the way only old, well-tended wood can. Lavinia held her hand there a long moment. Then she took it away. She did not say anything about it. She thanked the widow for the tea, and she walked back down the mountain in the gray afternoon light. And the widow watched her go, and thought about the strange and lonely thing that happens to a person when knowledge arrives too late to act on. 3 days later, the husband came back from the city, and whatever his wife said to him, in the privacy of that fine house with its proud, fragile windows, he did not come up the mountain. He did not withdraw his papers, but he did not send anyone to enforce them either. The fixed date sat there on its paper, under its stone, on the windowsill, waiting. And so did the winter. The deep cold came down quietly now, not all at once, in slow, patient increments that felt almost ordinary, a little colder each morning, a little earlier each dusk. Down in the valley, the people who had braced for a hard season began to relax, in the way people relax when the thing they feared does not arrive on the day they expected it. They moved their worry to other things, the price of cattle, the talk of a new road. But the widow did not relax. She watched the quiet sky the way she had once watched the faces of badly wounded men, looking for the specific, deceptive calm that comes just before the body makes its decision. She knew that calm. She knew what it meant. It did not mean that things were getting better. It meant only that whatever was coming had not yet chosen the hour to announce itself. She finished the last of her inside work. She sealed the final window frame. She reinforced the inner door. She checked every joint in the heater that warmed her home, one at a time, slowly, correctly, and then the next. And on the high ground above her land, in the dark old pines, the deep silence went on, gathering itself wider. and deeper and more complete. The silence before an ordinary storm is one thing, but the silence Idella Rowan had taught her to listen for, the silence before something else, had begun at last to settle over the whole of that mountain, and the widow heard it. And she put another log on her fire, and she waited. There came a stretch of days, deep in the season, when the cold seemed almost to relent. The sky cleared to a hard, clean blue. The mornings were bright and still, the kind of brightness that makes the mountains look closer than they are. And the people in the valley took it as a sign. A mild winter, after all the worry. A gift. They had braced for the worst, and the worst had not come. And so they let their shoulders drop, and they began to believe that they had braced for nothing. But the widow knew that brightness for what it was. She had seen this kind of calm before. It was the held breath of something large. It was the stillness of a thing gathering itself in the dark where no one was looking. And on one of those bright, deceptive mornings, Idella Rowan came down the mountain, not to visit, but to leave. The widow saw it on her face before the old woman said a single word. "I'm going down to the low country," Idella said. "To my people there. I'll stay until the thaw." The words took a moment to land, because in all the years the widow had known her, Idella Rowan had never once left the mountain for the cold season, not in the hard winters, not in the ones the old-timers still told stories about. She had outlasted every season this ridge had ever thrown at her, in a small stone place far less substantial than the widow's double-walled cabin. And now she was leaving. The widow did not say any of the things she was thinking. She said only, "When will the roads close after you go?" "A week," Idella said, "maybe less." They stood together in the bright, cold air, and the wind came down off the high ground with a smell in it that the widow had been tracking for days now. The smell of iron and stone and air that has traveled a very long way over very cold ground before arriving. Idella reached into the fold of her blanket, and she brought out a small parcel wrapped in cloth and tied with cord. She held it out. The widow took it. "Willow bark," the old woman said. "Dried root, wild honey from the high meadow, and one or two things of my own." She looked at the widow steadily. "You know what it's for." "Yes, it is not for you." The widow looked down at the parcel in her hands, at the careful knot in the cord. "How many?" she asked. Idella was quiet for a moment, a long moment. "More than one will come knocking before the thaw," she said. "Cold, frightened, some of them able to walk back out on their own 2 feet. She looked at the widow. "This is for the one who won't be." And she turned and she walked away down the bright white road. And the widow stood and watched her go. And the wind pulled at the cloth parcel in her hands. And up in the north, the color of the sky had something in it that did not belong to the bright morning at all. It was the color of something that had been gathering for a long, long time, and had finally decided to move. She drove back up the mountain in less than an hour. She put the horses in the barn and gave them an extra measure of feed, and she spent what was left of that day making certain that everything which needed to be inside was inside. The parcel from Idella she set on the shelf above the stove, right beside the weather journal, where she could see it from anywhere in the room. The last bright day came, and it was the strangest of them all. The sky at dawn was clear in a way that felt wrong. A hard, mineral blue, with no warmth in it at all, even when the sun had fully risen. The widow ate her breakfast, standing at the window. She watched the pines on the high ridge the way she had once watched a far horizon before the guns began, looking for the particular stillness that comes right before violence. And the stillness was there. By the middle of the afternoon, she felt the pressure change. It was a subtle thing, a shift she felt in her own bones, behind her eyes. The way old hurts wake up and speak when the air decides to drop. She knew that feeling. She had only ever felt it before one kind of weather. She went out and stood in the corridor between her two walls, and she listened. For a full minute, without moving. The wind had died completely. The pines stood without stirring a single needle, and in that deep silence, she could hear it, or thought she could. Far to the north, a low, sustained tone, not wind, not thunder, a sound with no direction at all, because it was coming from everywhere at once. She went back inside. She added 2 logs to the fire. She filled every pot and basin she owned with water from the barrel, and then she sat down in her chair with a book in her lap. And she waited for the mountain to keep its promise. It did not make her wait long. The sky did not slowly cloud over. It turned. In the space of 20 minutes, that hard blue gave way to a color she had no good word for. A deep, bruised purple gray. Not the color of an ordinary storm sky. Something older than that. Something deeper. The color of a very long time, expressing itself in the air. The light went strange. The shadows simply vanished. The whole ridge flattened into one uniform field of gray-white, where distance became impossible to judge. And then the wind arrived. It did not build. It came in one instant, from nothing to its full and terrible strength. And the sound of it was not like anything in the ordinary vocabulary of wind. It was a single, sustained roar that filled the whole skull and pressed against the ears from the inside. The sound of a vast country of cold air, moving at speed over rock and frozen ground, arriving all at once at this ridge, this cabin, this door. The outer wall took the first blow, and held. Inside, the fire in the heater did not so much as gutter. The temperature in the little cabin held perfectly steady, and the widow turned the page of her book. But down the ridge, in the fine houses built to impress, the night was unfolding very differently. Preston Vance's grand lodge had been built to be admired, and it was admired, but everything it had given up in order to be admired was coming due now. All of it. In a single night. His fine heating system was the best money could buy. A heavy thing, brought up from far away and installed by men who had never built anything meant to stand against what was now hitting the mountain. And it had one fatal weakness. A single length of bare iron pipe rising straight up above the roofline, exposed to the full force of the wind. The pipe froze from the outside in. In a matter of minutes, the blockage was complete, and the fire inside, suddenly starved of its draw, began to push its smoke back down into the room where Preston Vance sat. He crossed to the nearest window and threw it open to clear the air. The window was large. The windows were always large. That had been the entire point. And when it opened, the wind came in with everything it carried, and nothing held back. He fought it closed again. It took both his hands and all of his weight. And when at last he forced the latch to catch, the frame had warped in the sudden, brutal shock of cold, leaving a gap at one corner that he packed with his coat, and then his scarf, and then a folded quilt, all of which the wind went on breathing its cold straight through, with a patient and total indifference. By the deep middle of the night, the water in his wash basin had frozen solid. He sat on the floor, with his back against the inner wall, wearing every stitch of clothing he owned. And he was doing something he had not done since he was a small boy. He was afraid, truly afraid. He thought about the widow's cabin, up the ridge. He thought about going to it. And then he dismissed the thought. He thought about it again. And he dismissed it again. For reasons that had far more to do with the story he told himself about who he was, than with any honest reading of his situation. He pulled the quilts tighter around himself, and he told himself it would be better by morning. He was wrong about that, as he had been wrong about so much. At the Hale house, the catastrophe came along a different road, but it arrived just the same. Those great glass windows had been built well for ordinary weather. And in any ordinary winter, they would have held. But this was not an ordinary winter. The wind driving against the southern face of the house was carrying ice, small, hard crystals of it, at a speed that turned them from weather into something closer to shot. Edmund and Lavinia Hale had been awake for hours. They sat near the inner fireplace with the two hired men and the housekeeper, all of them listening to the great windows shudder in their frames. A sound like a single note held far too long on a strained string. Lavinia kept her eyes on the largest of the windows. She had been watching it for hours. She had seen it flex inward twice when the heaviest gusts struck, bending just enough to be seen, and then snapping back. Edmund said it was fine. He said it was good glass. He said he had paid for good glass. Edmund, she said, Lavinia, please, I need you to listen to me. He said that he was listening. If that glass breaks, she said, slowly, clearly, we cannot stay in this house. He told her the glass was not going to break. He was a man who had always believed that a thing, once paid for, would do what it had promised. Deep in the night, on the high ground above the house, a dead tree gave way. It had stood for years, held upright by nothing but the press of its neighbors, and the wind, at last, took it. It did not fall. It was lifted and driven sideways through the dark at a speed that made it something other than a tree. It struck the great central window with everything it weighed, and everything the wind had added to that weight. The glass did not break. It exploded. The sound was enormous and immediate and without any warning at all. And in the half second it took for that window to become 10,000 flying pieces. The inside of that fine house stopped being a shelter. The temperature dropped all at once by an amount that took the breath clean out of the body. The snow came in, not as flakes, as a solid horizontal wall of white that coated every surface the instant it touched. The fire in the inner hearth was extinguished in seconds, just gone. The logs, still there, suddenly meaningless. The housekeeper screamed. One of the hired men was already at the back door. The other stood frozen in the middle of the room, his arms thrown up over his face, and Edmund and Lavinia Hale looked at each other across that ruined room, through the snow that was already filling the inside of their own home, in the complete and roaring dark. "We have to go to her," Lavinia said. She was not asking. She had not been asking since the afternoon she pressed her bare hand against a warm wall 3 feet from a roaring wind, and understood, at last, what warmth that came from preparation truly felt like. Edmund Hale stood in the wreckage of his expensive, beautiful windows, and he thought about every decision he had made, the papers, the lawyer, the date set down on a calendar in a warm room far away, the dinner table where he had spoken so lightly about a stubborn widow and her fixed ideas. He thought about the look on his wife's face, the day she had come home with the truth in her hand and tried to give it to him, and he had called it sentiment. "Take everything warm you can carry," he said. "We go on foot." The hired men and the housekeeper made their own way down toward the lower road, where there was a chance of shelter. But Edmund and Lavinia turned the other way. They turned up the ridge, toward the strange wall they had tried to tear down. The distance between the two houses was short. On a clear day, on a good path, it was nothing at all. In what was happening on that mountain now, it was another country entirely. The drifts were waist deep in the open stretches. The wind hit them broadside on the exposed ground above the tree line, with a force that stopped them where they stood and made them lean into it at an angle that felt wrong in every muscle of the body. Lavinia lost a glove somewhere in the first minutes. She did not notice it go. She noticed only, sometime later, when her bare hand began to speak to her in the specific and frightening language of flesh approaching its limit. But they moved. They did not stop moving. Edmund kept his wife in front of him, his hands on her shoulders, and they pushed forward together into the white dark. And at some point, Lavinia's mind stopped forming whole thoughts. It began instead simply to count. The next foot of ground, and the next, and the next. Which is what the mind does, in the end, when it has accepted that thinking is a luxury, and that moving is the only thing left. The outer wall came up out of the white as a darker shape in the dark. Lavinia struck it with her good hand before she even saw it, and the solid, certain, unyielding feel of it went up through her palm and her arm and straight into her chest, like something she had been waiting her whole life to touch. Edmund found the outer door. He struck it with his fist. Once, twice, and then his strength gave out, and he struck it with his open palm. And then Lavinia was striking it too, both of them together, and the sound they were making was not as loud as it needed to be, and maybe it was not loud enough. And maybe they had made a mistake somewhere back along that white road that could not now be undone, because she might not hear them over the roar of the wind, and if she did not hear them, then there was nothing after that. There was only the cold, and the wall, and the dark. The door opened. The corridor between the walls was not warm. It was cold, deeply cold, but it was still. It was windless. And after what they had just walked through, the simple absence of wind felt like stepping out of a flooded river onto solid stone. They fell into it together. Snow tumbled in after them in a small avalanche, and the door swung shut, and the roar of the storm dropped to something contained, still enormous, still there, but held now on the far side of a thing built to hold it. The widow was already there. She had not been asleep. She stood in the corridor with a lamp raised in one hand, looking at the two of them with the expression of a person who had prepared for a very long time for exactly this moment, and found no satisfaction at all in having prepared correctly. She opened the inner door, and the heat of the cabin struck them both full in the face. Lavinia made a sound that was not a word. Edmund caught the door frame with both hands because his legs had decided all at once that they were finished, and the widow took each of them by the arm in turn, brisk and impersonal, a person whose only concern in that moment was function. "Coats off," she said. "Everything wet. Off. Now." Edmund looked at her. He was shaking too hard to hold her gaze. "We have to tell you something," he said. "Coats first," she said. "Then tell me." She got them to the fire. She wrapped them in dry wool. She set water to heat. She did all of it in the exact order that mattered, the order a person learns in a place where there is no time, and where the sequence of small actions is the difference between living and not. She put a cup of hot water, sweetened with the dark honey from Adela's parcel, into Edmund Hale's shaking hands. She watched his color. She watched his eyes. And then she said it. "Where is Mr. Vance?" The question landed in the room, and it changed everything in it. Edmund and Lavinia looked at each other with the look of two people who have just remembered something they had stopped thinking about because surviving had taken up all the room there was. "He was at his lodge when we passed," Lavinia said. "We knocked. He answered." She stopped. "He said he was managing. He said he was going out to his wagon for the extra blankets in the back." The widow looked at the clock on the mantel. Preston Vance's wagon stood at the bottom of his drive, a long way down a steep, open slope, in conditions that had been killing the living things on that mountain for longer than anyone had ever thought to build a lodge upon it, or set glass windows in it, or write fine letters home about how manageable it all was. She looked at the fire. She looked at the clock again. "How long ago?" she said. "Did you leave him?" Edmund's face did the thing a face does when a man realizes he already knows the answer he does not want to know. 2 hours, he said, maybe more. The widow stood up. She went to the hook by the inner door, where her heavy coat was hanging, and she put it on. "You can't go out there alone," Lavinia said. But the widow was already at the outer door. Her coat was buttoned. Her gloves were on. And the coil of orange rope was in her left hand, its free end already looped through the iron ring on the wall, and knotted with a hitch she had tied, and checked every season for years. She checked it now a third time, by touch, by feel. The way a person checks the one thing in the world that cannot be allowed to be wrong. "Keep the fire where it is," she said, "not higher. If you add wood, add one piece at a time. The draw is set just so." Edmund was on his feet, unsteady. "I'll come with you," he said. The widow looked at him, at the slight forward lean of a man whose body had not yet finished coming back to itself, at the careful, deliberate way he was standing, performing a steadiness he did not yet possess. "You'll go 10 yards, she said, "and fall." It was not unkind. It was simply the truth, spoken plainly, the way she spoke all true things. "Then tell me what to do from here," he said. "Watch her left hand." She nodded toward Lavinia, toward the hand wrapped in wool that Lavinia was not looking at. If the fingertips go white instead of red, put them against your own chest, under your shirt, skin to skin, right away. Don't wait for her to ask. Lavinia looked at her own wrapped hand, and then she looked at the widow with an expression that had moved entirely past the careful social register she had lived in for so long, and arrived somewhere far simpler and far more honest. "Please," she said, "come back." The widow opened the outer door, and the white swallowed her whole. The storm entered the corridor as a sound before it became anything else, a full-throated roar that filled the narrow space between the walls and pressed against her chest like a flat hand. She stepped through it. She pulled the door shut behind her, and the cold hit every inch of exposed skin at once. Her face, above the scarf, the thin gap at her wrist, the rim of one ear, where the wool cap had not quite reached. She began to feed out the rope, 400 yards of it. The wagon was perhaps a few hundred yards down the slope, if she remembered the placement right. And she was not certain she remembered it right, because distance in that white and roaring dark bore no honest relationship to distance as she knew it in daylight and calm. She knew the general line. She knew the slope. She knew the way the ground tilted as it came off the high shelf above the tree line, and the way the trees thinned before the open ground below. What she did not know was whether Preston Vance was still alive, and she did not let herself wonder about it, because that question had only one answer worth acting on, and she was already acting on it. The cold, at that depth, does not feel the way ordinary cold feels. It is not a temperature. It is a pressure, a thing that pushes against the whole body at once, from every side, searching for any small point of entry, with a patience that is not really patience, because patience would require a mind. She kept the scarf over her nose and mouth and breathed through it. She felt the moisture of her own breath freezing in the wool, and had to shift the cloth every little while to put a dry part against her face. The wind was worse than anything she had moved through since those war years she did not name. She had been so young then, and the cold of that long-ago campaign had taught her the single thing she needed now. That moving was the only thing she could control. So she moved. The rope paid out through her right hand, yard by yard, the bright orange of it going dark as it trailed away behind her into the white, and she kept her hand always on the line to the iron ring, the line to the door, the line to the fire. Every 30 or 40 yards she stopped, and she raised the old surveying glass she had taken from the shelf, the one Elias had used in better years, that she had adapted over time for seeing in low light. The difference in warmth out there was so extreme tonight that even through that imperfect glass she could see a living thing, if a living thing was there to be seen. At the first stop, she saw nothing. At the second stop, she saw nothing. The rope was paying out faster than she had expected, which meant she was moving faster than she thought, which meant the slope was steeper here than her memory had told her. She adjusted her line, leftward, toward the trees she could feel more than see. At the third stop, she raised the glass, and she swept it, slowly, right to left, across the ground below the tree line, and she saw the wagon, buried on 3 sides. And beside the rear wheel, a shape that was not snow or rock or any of the other things that make shapes in a storm. A dim warmth, not the bright warmth of a person awake and moving and making heat. The faint, fading warmth of a body that was losing its argument with the cold. She dropped the rope, and the 15 yards between her and that shape were the longest 15 yards of ground she had crossed since one bright, terrible afternoon long ago, when she had run across open country toward a fallen man she was not certain was still alive. Then she had been young and running. Now she was 46 and fighting through drift that reached her thigh at every step, while the wind worked to turn her from a moving thing into a still one. She reached the wagon. She reached the shape beside the wheel. Preston Vance was curled on his side against the hub, his knees drawn up to his chest, his eyes open to a thin, glassy slit, and his coat was unbuttoned, the front of it pushed back, the shirt beneath pulled open at the collar. His hat lay on the ground a few inches from his hand, as though he had taken it off, carefully, and set it down. His face was the color of old candle wax. The widow had seen this before. The body, in its very last extremity, makes one final and convincing lie. It tells itself that it is warm. And a person in the grip of that lie will take off his own clothing, calmly, deliberately, like a man who has made a reasonable decision. It was the most dangerous thing the cold did, not the shivering, not the pain. This quiet, gentle, fatal warmth. She pressed her ear to his chest, against the open shirt, and she listened. 1 second, 2, 3, and she heard it. His heart, slow, profoundly slow, but there, beating on with the stubborn indifference of a muscle that had not yet been told it was supposed to stop. "All right," she said into the roar that swallowed her voice the instant it left her mouth. "All right." She pulled his coat closed. She got him sitting upright against the wheel. And then she got herself under his right arm. And she stood, and he came up with her. All at once. All of his weight, with no help at all from any part of him. The full measure of what she was lifting went through her back and her knees and her shoulders, all in the same instant. He was not a small man. He was the weight of a person who had made choices she disagreed with, who had been cruel to her in a crowded store, who had written letters calling her wall a foolish thing. And he was also a young man who was going to die in the snow if she set him down. She did not set him down. She found the rope with her free hand, the line trailing back through the dark toward the ring, and the door, and the fire, and she began to walk. There are efforts a body makes that go beyond what a body is supposed to be able to do, and the people who make them almost never remember them clearly afterward, not because memory fails, but because the mind, in those minutes, is not doing the work of remembering. It is doing only the work of continuing. She would not afterward remember the particular steps of that walk back, the open ground, the slope, the granite shelf. She would remember the rope, the bright fiber going through her right hand, yard by yard, each yard meaning she was closer and not farther. Each yard a yard she would not have to cross again. She would remember one moment, when her knee buckled on a patch of wind-scoured ice beneath the surface of the drift, and she went down onto it and stayed there 3 full seconds, Preston's weight shifting across her shoulders, and she thought, clearly and without any drama at all, "Get up. Now." And she got up, and she would remember hitting the wall, Her shoulder found the timber before her eyes did. The solid face of the structure she had built with her own 2 hands over a whole long season. The wall they had laughed at. The wall they had printed in a paper under a cruel little headline. The wall they had sent papers up this mountain, twice, ordering her to tear down. And when her shoulder struck that wood, the sound it made was the best sound she had heard in longer than she could say. She found the door by feel. She worked the latch with one hand. She pulled it open and went in, and the corridor closed around them both, and the storm became, once more, a sound on the far side of a wall, and she stood there in the narrow dark with a man's whole weight across her shoulders. And she allowed herself 3 seconds, only 3, just to breathe, before she reached out and opened the inner door. Edmund Hale was on his feet before she was fully through it. Whatever warmth and rest the last hour had given him, it had been enough. He crossed the room and took Preston's weight from her left side without being asked, without a word, and together they brought the young man down to the floor, near the stove. "What do we need?" Edmund said. And it was the right question, not asked out of helplessness, asked out of readiness. The widow noticed the difference. She would remember that she noticed it. "The parcel," she said, "on the shelf, the cloth one. Open it." Lavinia was already there. She brought it down. She untied the cord, and the cloth fell open, and there inside were the things the old woman had prepared, with the knowledge of a long lifetime on that mountain, and the memory of one killing winter, and the graves it had left in ground too hard to dig, and the widow went to work. She knew the narrow margin of bringing a frozen body back, the space between too fast and too slow, far narrower than most people ever understand. And she worked inside that margin with the focus of a person who cannot afford to be even a little bit wrong. She got his wet layers off. She wrapped his body in dry wool. She raised his feet slightly on a folded canvas. She steeped the willow bark in water that was hot, but not boiling, and she added the honey by the spoonful, and she tested the warmth of it against the inside of her own wrist before it ever touched his lips. Edmund sat by Preston's head and did not speak. He had taken off his coat. His color was full again, and he watched the widow work with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the polished attention of a man of law, reading a brief. Not the social ease of a man at his own grand table. Something stripped of all of that. The simple, undefended attention of a human being. Watching a thing that truly mattered. In the second hour, Preston Vance began to shiver. Violently. Completely. And it was the best thing that had happened since the widow came back through her door, because shivering meant the body had decided on its own to begin making heat again. It had stopped its long, quiet surrender, and chosen instead the hard and painful work of coming back. The widow laid her hand flat on his chest and felt the muscles working there, and adjusted what she was doing. And slowly, hour by hour, he climbed back up out of the dark. By the deepest part of the night, he had drifted from a total absence into a confused and partial waking, surfacing for a moment, then sliding back under. And then, at last, he was present. His eyes tracked the ceiling, then the fire. Then the widow's face when she leaned over him. He spoke. in a voice that was barely a voice at all. "Is this your house?" "Yes," she said. He was quiet a moment. He looked at the heavy log walls, at the low timber ceiling, at the steady fire in the stove. "It's warm," he said, as though it were a fact he was reporting, a thing he had discovered. "It is," she said. "Drink this." He drank, and then he slept, and she let him sleep. Outside, the storm did not end that night. It did not end the next day either. It went on with the sustained, patient commitment of a thing that had been gathering for years, and had no interest at all in a brief performance. It buried the ridge. It made the distances between the houses meaningless. Because there were no distances anymore. Only quantities of snow and wind that nothing living could reasonably cross. And inside the little cabin, 4 people lived in a closeness none of them had chosen. And all of them, now, required. The wall held. It held through gusts that bent the great pines on the high ground. It held through the pressure changes that cracked and popped the timber of every other structure on that mountain. It held because it had been built to hold one piece, correctly, and then the next, each part serving the whole. Nothing on it for show, a thing made not to be admired, but to work. And in the warm dark, on a pallet by the stove, a young man who had once called it foolish slept on and lived. The storm broke on the morning of the 4th day. It did not apologize. It simply stopped, the way enormous things stop, without warning, without ceremony. The wind fell away over the course of a single hour, dropping from its long and terrible roar, down to something almost gentle. The sky cleared from the far edge of the high country in a long blue line that moved slowly across the mountains, like a decision being quietly reversed, and the snow that remained was deep and absolute in total. It had remade the whole ridge into a country that no longer resembled anything anyone in that cabin had ever seen. From the window, the Hale house was only a shape beneath the white, the roof line still there, but the southern face dark and caved and wrong, where the great glass windows had once been. Preston Vance's Grand Lodge was still standing, but it wore all over its proud body the marks of a thing that had been asked to do far more than it had ever been built to do. And every tree on the exposed high ground was sheathed in ice along its northern face, each one a small, silent record of the direction and the force of what had passed through that night. The 4 of them stood at the window together in the early light and looked out at it. And for a while, no one said a word. There was nothing to say that the view did not already say better. They did not leave at once. The deep snow saw to that. The road down the mountain would not open for days. And in those days, something happened inside that little cabin that none of them had planned for, and none of them would ever quite be able to explain afterward. They became easy with one another. The closeness that had begun as the desperate crowding of strangers slowly turned into something else. The quiet of people who have come through a true and frightening thing together. People who have nothing left to prove to each other on the other side of it. There were 2 chairs and the floor near the stove, and the widow's own narrow bed. She gave the bed to Lavinia Hale without a word of discussion, and Lavinia took it without a word of argument. Edmund slept in the larger chair, folded into it like a man who had decided comfort was a thing for other nights. and Preston slept on the pallet of blankets and canvas by the stove, which was exactly where he needed to be. The widow herself did not truly sleep. She moved through those hours in short stretches of rest and watching. 2 hours down, then up to feed the fire, to lay a hand on Preston's brow, to check the seal of the outer door against the great drift building up against it. The short, broken sleep of a person who cannot fully let go of the thing that still needs watching, but she did not mind it. There was something in that close, crowded warmth that she had not felt in her cabin in a very long time. The simple, animal comfort of other breathing in the dark. On the second morning, she woke to find Edmund Hale's chair empty. For a moment, her heart caught. And then she heard him, out in the corridor, between the two walls, the careful, deliberate sounds of a man working at something in the cold. She rose and crossed to the inner window and looked out, and she saw him, Edmund Hale, the lawyer who had sent papers up her mountain. Twice, rearranging her woodpile, he was turning the cut pieces she had stacked against the outer wall so that the bark faces went inward and the cut faces went out. A small thing, a marginal thing, but a real one. It would let the wood stack hold the cold out just a little better. He was not doing it because anyone had asked him to. He was doing it because he had spent 2 days watching how that corridor worked, with the close attention of a careful mind, and had found the one small thing he could make better. She watched him a long moment through the frosted glass. Then she went back to the stove and set the coffee on. When he came in, stamping the cold from his boots, she handed him a cup without a single word about what she had seen him doing. He took it. He sat. He was quiet for a while. And then he said it. "That complaint, the papers I sent up here. I know. I'm withdrawing all of it. The moment the road opens, the boundary claim, the order, all of it. You don't have to. I know I don't have to." He looked down into his cup. "I want to be clear about that part. I'm not doing it as payment. I'm not doing it because you went out into that storm and brought a man back." He turned the cup slowly in his hands. "I'm doing it because I was wrong. And a man ought to be able to say that, when it's true, out loud, without needing a reason that lets him off the hook." The widow looked at him a long moment. There was a version of this man she had been told about, all season long. The one who used the law the way other men used a firm handshake. Who told the people at his fine dinner table exactly what they wanted to hear. Who had looked at his own wife's clear, quiet sight and called it sentiment because the truth of it would have complicated his comfort. That version of him was somewhere still in this room. But the man sitting across from her now was different enough that it was worth speaking to directly. "What you did to the woodpile," she said. He looked up. "That was the right adjustment. You saw the problem. You fixed it. And you didn't make a performance out of fixing it." She paused. "That is the only thing this mountain has ever asked of anyone. Not admiration, not apology, just the willingness to look hard at what's true and then act on it." Edmund Hale was quiet for a long while, and then he said a thing she had not expected him to say. "I heard what you told my wife," he said, "when she came up here, before the snow. She told me about it after. She showed me her hand." He looked at the fire. "She touched your inner wall, and she said it was warm. 3 feet from a freezing wind, and the wall was warm under her hand. She didn't even have to explain it to me. I understood what she meant the moment she said it." He stopped, and I chose not to. I heard the truth in my own kitchen from a woman I love, and I called it sentiment, and I sent for my lawyer instead. It was the most honest thing the widow had heard a grown man say about himself in a very long time. She did not soften it for him, and she did not pile on to it either. She simply let it sit there in the warm air of the cabin, where it had been said. Let a hard truth breathe, instead of rushing to bury it under comfort. "The spring will come," she said at last. "It always does, in the end. And when it does, you'll have a house to rebuild. We will. Build something that listens to this place," she said, "instead of arguing with it. There are people in this valley who know how. Quiet people. The kind nobody puts in a newspaper. I can give you their names." And Edmund Hale nodded. Not the nod of a man bringing a conversation to a polite close. The nod of a man writing something down in a place inside himself where it would not be lost. Across the small room, his wife sat by the window. Lavinia Hale had spent these days doing something the widow suspected she had not done in years. Nothing. She sat. She watched the light change on the snow. She held her healing hand near the warmth of the stove and turned it slowly, studying it the way a person studies a thing they almost lost. And on the third afternoon, when the men were resting and the cabin was still, Lavinia came and sat near the widow at the table. She did not say anything for a while. Then, quietly, she said, "I knew, before any of it. I sat in your cabin that day, and I drank your tea, and I touched your wall, and I knew." She looked at her own hand. "And I went home, and I told the one person who could have done something about it. And he called it a feeling, and I let him." The widow was quiet. "I let him," Lavinia said again, softer, "because it was easier than being the woman who knew something her clever husband did not. I made myself small, so the room would stay comfortable. I have been making myself small for a very long time." The widow looked at her across the table, and she did not offer her any of the easy things, the reassurances that cost nothing and mean less. "You walked up this mountain in the dark," the widow said, "in the worst night this ridge has seen in a lifetime. You lost a glove, and you kept your feet, and you got here alive." She let that sit. "That is not a small woman, whatever you've been telling yourself." Lavinia Hale looked at her for a long moment, and something behind her eyes loosened. Not all at once. The deep knots never loosen all at once. But it loosened. From his pallet by the stove, Preston Vance had been listening, with his eyes closed, for some time. He spoke now, without opening them. "The rope," he said. "The orange one. By your door. Why is it that particular length?" The question arrived without warning, and the widow felt it land in the exact place where she kept the things she did not take out very often. She was quiet long enough that Edmund looked up from his cup. "My husband died," she said at last, "in a storm that was not supposed to amount to anything." She kept her voice level, not because she felt nothing, but because she had learned long ago that level was the register in which the important things got said, the things that would crack apart if you said them any louder. He went out to check his trap lines. On a trail, he knew the way he knew his own hands. And the weather turned on him, and he made it back to within a few hundred yards of this very door. She looked at the fire, and there was nothing out there to guide him those last yards. No line, no marker, nothing in all that white to tell him which way the door was. He was that close, and it was as good as 100 miles. Preston had opened his eyes. He was looking at the ceiling. "And the rope is twice that distance," the widow said. 400 yards, long enough to reach the place where he fell, and still have rope left over to spare. The fire shifted in the stove. The cold pressed against the outer wall, and the wall, as it had all through that long and terrible night, declined to give. "You built all of this," Preston said slowly, "for him." "I built it for the next person who would need it," she said. "He is only the reason I knew it needed building." Preston Vance lay there a long time with his bandaged hands resting on his chest and said nothing at all. And then, very quietly, he said, "I wrote a letter once about your wall. I told people far away from here that it was the foolish project of a foolish woman." "I know." "I thought I was describing something ridiculous." "You were describing something you didn't understand," she said. "That's a different thing. There's no shame in not understanding. The shame is only in laughing at the thing instead of asking about it." He turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were clearer now than they had been at any moment since she'd found him curled against that wagon wheel. A young man, humbled, in a way that, for the first time since she'd known him, did not look like a performance for a watching room. "What I said to you that day in the store," he said, "about fear and preparation. I thought I was being clever. I thought the whole room thought I was clever." "You were," she said. "That was rather the trouble with you." A faint, broken thing that might have been the beginning of a laugh crossed his face. "It was a stupid thing to say," he said. "Yes. I'm sorry for it. Truly." "I know you are," she said, and she looked at him without any harshness in it, and without the satisfaction that would have cheapened the whole moment. "When you build again, Mr. Vance," she said, "build something that will still be standing when you're an old man. Not something that will impress strangers while you're a young one. The mountain doesn't care what impresses people. It only cares what holds." He closed his eyes, and he slept. And this time, it was the deep, full, easy sleep of a body that has finally been given permission to rest now. Here is where this story might have ended, with the road opening and the apologies all given and a whole town learning in one great satisfying turn that the strange widow had been right the entire time. That is how these stories usually go. The mockers humbled, the outcast proven. A grand public reckoning where everyone who ever laughed is made, at last, to see. But that was not quite how it ended on that mountain, because the thing that truly changed the widow in the end was not the moment the valley finally understood her. It was a far quieter thing than that. The road opened on the 5th day. The deputy came first. Wyatt Shaw, on foot, over the high snow, ahead of the men and the road crew. He came to her outer door with the look of a man who had done the arithmetic on this situation many times over the past days, and had kept arriving at the same hard answer. "Everyone," he said. It was not quite a question. "Everyone," she answered. "All 4. Alive." He let out a breath she suspected he had been holding for some time. He looked past her, toward the inner door, as though he could see straight through it to the living people on the far side. And then he looked at the wall, the structure he had ridden up this mountain in the autumn to order her to stop building, the structure that had done exactly what she had told him it would do, and had stood whole and unbroken, while every other building on this ridge bore the deep marks of the long night. "Mr. Hale's complaint," he said. "I went to the office about it. Before the snow even came in, I told them the boundary claim was built on a bad survey, that what you'd built was on land nobody truly disputed." He paused. It was the right reading of the law. I knew it was. And I should have read it that way the first time, back in the autumn, when it would have spared you a season of worry. The widow looked at him steadily. "You didn't enforce the order in the autumn," she said, "when you could have. That mattered, deputy." He was quiet a moment. "Not as much as reading it right the first time would have." "No," she agreed. "Not as much as that." She let the honesty of it stand between them, but it still mattered. He nodded slowly, and then he went back up the ridge the way he had come, his snowshoes leaving one clean single track in all that new white. Harlan Briggs came on the day after, in a hired wagon behind the road crew, with the bed of it full of supplies. Flour and meal and tins and the small necessary things that someone who understood what a cut-off household needs after long days alone had gathered up and paid for and said not one word about. And his daughter was with him, Nessa. She had insisted on coming. The widow could read as much in the look on Harlan's face, that particular helpless look of a father who has discovered somewhere along the way that his child has opinions he can no longer argue down. And Nessa did not wait to be told what to do. She carried the flour and the meal and the tins to the outer door and stacked them and went back for the next load, moving with the brisk, sure efficiency of a girl who had been raised among shelves and goods. And then Preston Vance came out of the cabin, for the first time since the widow had carried him in over her shoulder, moving carefully, on feet that still pained him, his hands wrapped in the clean white linen she had put on them that morning. He stood in the doorway of the outer wall a moment and watched the girl work, and then he stepped forward and picked up one end of a heavy sack to help her angle it through the door. Edmund Hale came out and bent and took up what was left, and Harlan Briggs stood beside his empty wagon in the bright cold and watched. He watched two grown men who had spent a whole season finding his jokes about the widow so very funny, now doing the plain, quiet work of carrying her supplies through her door. He watched his own daughter directing the whole of it, a girl who had decided long before any of them exactly what mattered, and was simply acting on it. And the widow came to her outer door, and she and Harlan Briggs looked at each other across the snowy yard. He was not the same man who had laid that folded newspaper on his counter in the autumn for the whole store to laugh at. Or rather, he was. Same man, same store, same beard, but something inside him had been moved, quietly. The kind of shift a person does not announce, even to himself. A door opened somewhere in a back room he had kept shut a long time. "I should have sold you that extra cord of wood," he said, "when you came in for it, and I said you wouldn't be needing it. I should have just sold it to you and kept my mouth shut." It was not an apology. Not exactly. It was something more precise than an apology. The plain admission of one small, specific, practical mistake, which, from a man like Harlan Briggs, was probably as close to the true heart of the matter as anything grander would ever have managed to get. "Come in," the widow said. "Have some coffee. It's a cold ride down." And he came in. Now, the old version of this story would want to linger here, on the great public reckoning, on Harlan Briggs, sitting humbled in the widow's warm cabin, finally and fully forced to see. And that did happen. He sat by her fire and held his cup in both his broad hands and looked around at the simple log walls and the steady stove and the spare, careful order of a place that had been built for one purpose only, and had served that purpose completely on the one night it was ever asked to. And he asked her quietly, with a real and naked bewilderment, how she had known. Not how she had guessed, how she had known. And she told him the truth. "I watched," she said, "the wind, the bark, the animals. I read what my husband left behind and what the old woman up the ridge taught me. And then, when the answer turned out to be inconvenient, when it meant work and mockery and a wall everyone would laugh at." She looked at him. "I didn't look away. That's the whole of it. There's no magic in it. Just the long, stubborn refusal to stop seeing a thing the moment it gets hard to see." Harlan nodded slowly, turning that over. It was not the answer he had been expecting. There was nothing in it he could argue with, and nothing in it that flattered her, and nothing in it that let him off easy. It was just the truth. And the truth, he was discovering, was a thing you took home with you and carried for a long while after. But that was not the moment the story turned. The moment came a little after, when the girl, Nessa, looked up from the table where she had been helping Lavinia Hale sort and stack the goods, and she said, in front of all of them, in her plain young voice, "Will you teach me what you know about the mountain, about the signs?" And the whole room went still, and the widow looked at the girl, at that open, honest, unguarded face, at the practical, capable hands, at the eyes that had stopped laughing all those months ago, at exactly the right moment, and had never once started again. "Come up in the spring," the widow said, "when the snow is off the upper trail. We'll start with the bark." And that was the moment. Not the apologies, not the wagon heavy with supplies, not the deputy's clean track in the snow, or Harlan Briggs humbled by his own fire, but a girl, motherless, 16, asking to be given the one thing the widow had left in all the world to give. Because here is what the widow understood in that quiet cabin with the late light turning gold across the snow outside the window. She had spent years living with a question she had never let herself fully ask: whether she had chosen this mountain or simply failed all this time to leave it. Whether she stayed because there was real work for her here, or only because the man she had loved was in the ground down the slope, and to leave would mean leaving the last place on earth his hands had ever touched. She had carried that question through the building, and the mockery, and the law, and the long white night, with a man's whole weight across her shoulders. And she had always assumed the answer, if it ever came at all, would arrive the way answers arrive in stories. In some great, clear, ringing moment, a thunderclap of certainty. It did not arrive that way. It arrived in a girl's plain voice, asking to learn the bark of a tree, because the widow saw, all at once, that the question had never truly been about her. It did not matter whether she had chosen the mountain or been chosen by her grief. That was an old riddle, and a selfish one, and it had kept her turned inward for far too many winters. What mattered was what she did with whatever time she had left upon it, and what she had was knowledge. Knowledge of the wind and the bark, and the heavy coats of the animals before a hard season. Knowledge of how to keep the killing cold out of a wall, and how, perhaps, to keep the long dark out of a heart. It had come to her from a husband who was gone, from an old woman higher up the ridge, from one terrible winter in another lifetime that she still did not speak of. And knowledge, she understood now, with a clarity that ran deeper than any thought, had never been meant to be kept. It was meant to be handed on, from the old woman to her, from her to the girl, and from the girl, one day, to whoever came after her. A long, quiet chain of attention. The only true answer there had ever been to the cold, and the dark, and the plain, hard, ancient fact that the mountain would never once change its nature to suit a single human wish. She had not needed the valley to be sorry. She saw that now, too. She had not needed Harlan Briggs to finally see, or Preston Vance to apologize, or Edmund Hale to withdraw his papers, or the deputy to read the law right at last. Those things were fine. Those things were even good. But they were not what she had been building toward through all those long months of solitary work. What she had been building toward, without ever once letting herself know it, was a person to give it all to. The afternoon moved on, slowly, toward evening. Harlan and Nessa left before the dark came down, the wagon track lying plain and clear on the white road below. At the gate, the girl turned, and she raised one hand, and the widow raised hers in return, and held it there a moment longer than she needed to. Long after the wagon had begun to move, the Hales would go in the morning, when the road was fully clear, back down to the wreck of their grand house to begin again, more wisely this time. Preston would stay 2 more days until they could be certain his hands would mend. These things arranged themselves quietly, without any negotiation at all. Around the people who are willing to tend to them, the necessary things always seem to find their own order. And that evening, after the fire had been built up for the night, and the cabin had settled into the easy, breathing quiet of people who are no longer strangers to one another, the widow sat alone at her table, with the old weather journal open before her, and she wrote the entry for those days, the cold, the wind, the depth of the snow, what she had seen and what she had done, and how, in the end, it had all come out. She wrote it in the same careful hand she had used for years, the long, patient continuation of a conversation with a man who was no longer there to read a word of it. But for the first time in all those years, it did not feel quite so much like a conversation with the dead, because come the spring, there would be a girl on the upper trail, learning to read the bark of a lodgepole pine for the water held inside it. And someday, that girl would keep a journal of her own, in her own careful hand, and the conversation would go on, past the widow, past Nessa, on and on, down the long years, in voices not yet born. The widow set down her pen. She sat a moment with her hand flat on the open page. She thought about her husband, about the old woman up the ridge, waiting out the cold in the low country, about the girl who had stopped laughing at exactly the right moment, and she felt something she had not felt in a very, very long time. Not happiness. That was too small a word for it, and the wrong shape entirely. Something quieter than happiness, and far deeper. The feeling of a person who has, at long last, set down a weight she had carried so long she had stopped feeling it as a weight at all. The weight of believing that her years on this mountain had been only an ending. A widow, waiting out the rest of a life beside a grave, when all along they had been a beginning. She simply had not had the eyes to see it. She closed the journal. She looked into the low, steady fire, and then she rose and went to the hook beside the inner door. And she took down the orange rope. She ran it through her hands, end to end, the whole long length of it, feeling by touch for any weakness the night might have worked into the fibers. She found none. 400 yards, all of it whole. But she did not this time simply coil it back onto its iron ring and go to her bed. She stood there a while, holding it. This rope she had bought in the rawest days of her grief. This rope she had hung beside her door and told every visitor was only for the horses. This rope that had been, for so many long and private years, a quiet monument to a man she had not been able to save. And she understood now, holding it in the firelight, that it had quietly become something else. It was not a thing for the dead anymore. It was a thing for the living, for the next lost soul on this mountain, and the one after that, and the one after that. For a girl, perhaps, years from now, who would tie her own steady knot through her own iron ring and step out into her own white dark to bring a frightened stranger home. The widow coiled the rope gently and hung it back in its place. And in the doing of it, the grief did not leave her. It would never entirely leave her. She knew that now, and she had, at last, made some kind of peace with it. But it had changed its nature. It had stopped being a wall she lived behind, and had become, instead, a kind of door, one she could finally walk through, to reach the living people on the other side of it. She put one last log on the fire. She checked the door of the stove. She turned the lamp down low, to its quiet overnight glow. And outside, the night closed over the ridge, deep and clear, and utterly still. The stars came out over the high country, the same stars that had hung there on the night she lost everything she had, and the same stars that hung there now, on the night she finally understood that she had not, after all, lost everything. That grief, in the end, is only love, love with nowhere left to go, and that the bravest thing a person can do in a cold and indifferent world is to find it somewhere to go anyway, to turn it outward toward the next soul in the dark. She did not feel alone that night. For the first time in more years than she cared to count, she did not feel alone at all. The fire settled in the stove. The wall stood firm around the little cabin, against the patient and ancient cold, and the widow slept. And on the upper trail, under the deep snow, the bark of the old pines waited for spring, and for the girl who was coming to learn how to read it.